Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Hello, and welcome to Decarbonizing the Built Environment, hosted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. This is the fifth session in the CSIS Climate Solutions series, which looks at what it would take to reach net zero global greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 from a sectoral perspective. Today, we are focused on buildings, a sector that is important but often overlooked in the decarbonization discussion. We talk a lot about the power sector and how it contributes 40% of greenhouse gas emissions, but much of that power actually is consumed in buildings, like we're all doing today when we participate in today's session. In fact, when we just look at buildings and the built environment, it's responsible for about 39% of emissions. My name is Philip Benoit, and I'm a non-resident senior associate with the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at CSIS, and I'll be today's moderator. I previously worked as the division head of the Energy Efficiency and Environment Division at the International Energy Agency, where I was responsible, among other things, for managing the launch of the Energy Efficiency Market Reports, the Multiple Benefits Work Program, and the Energy Efficiency in Emerging Economies Program. And so for me, it's very exciting to be able to participate in today's event with three distinguished panelists. First, we'll have Clay Nessler, who's Vice President of Global Sustainability and Industry Initiatives at Johnson Controls. He's also the interim president of the Alliance to Save Energy. We're also joined by Debbie Weil, who's manager of the Buildings Initiative at the World Resources Institute Ross Center for Sustainable Cities. And finally, by Amy Cortez, who's the director of programs at the New Buildings Institute. In order to get us started, Clay, if you would kindly give us a presentation that sort of sets out some of the background for the audience, as well as some of the issues that we face in this critical sector. Clay? Clay, I think you're muted. The beauties of Zoom. There we go.
There we go. Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Great. Thanks, Philip. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me to participate on this panel. So I'd like to just provide a little background information to set up our panel discussion today. Indeed, buildings are important, but why is decarbonizing buildings important? I'm reminded of the famous quote when they asked Willie Sutton, why do you rob banks? His answer was, because that's where the money is. And of course, that quote goes down in history, probably forever. Why do we focus on buildings? Why do we focus on cities? Because that's where a lot of energy is used and a lot of carbon emissions emanate from. In fact, 70% of global energy use is in cities, and the largest source of energy use in cities are in fact the built environment, both institutional, commercial, and residential buildings. Very pertinent today is that a very large source of greenhouse gas emissions comes from the built environment. In fact, 28% of global CO2 emissions come from building operations. Building operations includes the energy required to light buildings, to heat buildings, to cool buildings, to provide all the services for everyone who lives, works, and visits buildings. But that's not the only source of carbon emissions in the built environment. 11% of carbon emissions come from building materials and construction at the front end of a building life cycle. Think of the steel, think of the concrete, think of the activities involved in preparing a site, building a building, getting it commissioned and operating. Increasingly, we're able to apply technology to quickly reduce the CO2 emissions through operations, and I'll talk a little bit about what some of those measures are. But the embodied material, the embodied energy and carbon in materials remains a big challenge and a strong focus in the industrial sector to decarbonize manufacturing. Interesting factoid, 2/3 of buildings in 2050 will still, 2/3 of current buildings will still be here in the future. So that is a problem that's referred to as lock-in. Inefficient buildings and technology, which exists in buildings today, is locked in until the technology is upgraded or the building is rebuilt, repurposed, knocked down, and a new one is built. The bad news is that the current renovation rate for existing buildings, commercial buildings, residential, around the world, is less than 1%, somewhere between 0.5 and 1%. Current estimates by IEA, the World Green Building Council, many sources suggest that number has to be a lot closer to 3% in order to be able to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement. So we're talking about more than tripling, essentially, the rate of renovation of existing buildings. Now let's talk about new construction. It's expected that the global building stock will double in square feet or square meters, as you will, by 2060. So what does a doubling of the global building stock really look like? Well, it looks like this. It looks like New York City. It looks like building a New York City every month for the next 40 years. The variation on the theme I heard is all the real estate in Canada every month. So that gives you a sense of the trend towards urbanization. People moving from rural areas into cities, cities expanding, doubling our square foot and not renovating existing buildings will present a very significant challenge to our efforts to mitigate and control global warming. So what are we going to do to decarbonize the built environment? Well, I like to think of it in this term, that there are 4 good deeds that we can do to accelerate the trend towards net zero energy or net zero carbon buildings. And DEED is, of course, an acronym. The first D is decarbonization. We need to rely on the fact that the supply of energy to buildings will decarbonize over the time, right? That decarbonization could come through the use of on-site solar PV panels or micro wind. It could come by microgrids providing clean electrons within a community or in a campus scale. It can also come from the continual decarbonization of the electric grid. It might also come from renewable sources of fuels, such as gas or other fuels that can help decarbonize the heating processes within buildings. Now, that is obviously important, but in order to truly decarbonize the built environment, there is a clear trend towards electrification. Renewable sources of heating fuel certainly have its place, particularly certainly in industrial facilities where there are very high temperature requirements. But in commercial buildings and residences, the traditional path will be through electrification, using heat pumps to heat water, to heat spaces, and as well as for cooking. This will represent a very large transition in a lot of countries. We see this in the United States today. There's very strong policy and incentives to use heat pumps to provide water heating, space heating, and cooking. You see it emerging in California. You see strong efforts in New York. Now, the potential problem is if we could flip a switch, no pun intended, and electrify everything, imagine the demands on the grid from a generation, from a transmission, and from a distribution standpoint. And buildings aren't the only thing that are going to electrify, so is transportation. So plugged into all those buildings will be EVs at some point. So it's kind of a race between building renewable energy capacity at a grid scale and converting transportation and buildings into buildings that use that electricity. So it's imperative that we do efficiency first. We need to first make the buildings more efficient, using less energy. The electrification appliances we use need to be more efficient than their electric resistance heat alternatives or their fossil fuel alternatives in order to reduce demand. I mean, we're talking on the scale 40, 50% reductions in energy use in order to balance the additional requirements for the grid. And speaking of the grid, it's going to have to get smarter. We know that buildings will no longer just be consumers of energy. They're going to be producers of energy. They're going to store energy. They're going to control energy. They're going to require the types of sensing and controls that will allow it to be an active element on a smart grid. There's a big initiative called Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings, which takes advantage of the fact that this intelligence will allow buildings to reduce loads, shift loads, be able to wiggle in response to the need to control voltage and power on the grid. So it's a combination of these four things that are really critical in being able to decarbonize buildings. I'd like to just share two great examples of the current state of the art in being able to do this at two different scales in two different climates. This is currently my favorite building. This is the Powerhouse Kaya. It's in Trondheim, Norway. This, I believe, when it was completed this past year, is probably the greenest building on the planet. This is a trophy that I think changes on an annual basis, but they have a lot of things going in their favor. One is, imagine the challenge of having a carbon positive building at like 60 some degrees north latitude. It sits on Trondheim Bay. You can see that the building is a fairly traditional office building, and someone with a very large cake knife basically sliced the roof at a 24-degree angle and drilled a hole through the top of it. Now that hole through the top, surrounded with two layers of fenestration or glass, super insulating the inside, which gets lots of light there. The entire roof of the building is covered with solar PV. In fact, it generates so much additional electricity that it can charge 200 EVs connected to the building over the course of a typical day. It's an 8-story office building. It has 30,000 square feet of solar. The heating uses electrification. There's a heat pump which takes water out of Trondheim Bay and either heats or uses the cooling of the bay to air condition the building. The heat pump has a natural refrigerant with a GWP of essentially 0. So it not only is super efficient, it also has no direct GHG emissions loss through the heat pump. This building is connected to a district energy system with a bunch of downtown buildings, including a hospital and other commercial areas, and it can exchange heat. It can help heat the other buildings. It can use heat if it needs buildings. So it's part of a community-wide energy system that is very resilient and very efficient. It is filled with smart controls. In fact, there are 14 technology systems in the building, all connected over a single IP network. It's essentially like a data center of a building based on its technology capability. And the lighting, the LED lighting actually is powered through the digital cables. So it is a very, very sophisticated building. Individuals in this building get individualized control. The air is distributed through the floor. It knows when you're in your office. It knows your preferences. It adjusts your lights. So the reason it can use so little energy is not just its energy efficiency envelope, but the fact that it only controls areas of the building where there are people, and it does it to their preferences. There are a number of these powerhouse buildings throughout Norway, and they're all centrally monitored and managed to optimize the overall performance of the buildings. Now let's look at a zero carbon facility that's completely different. This is Maui College in Maui, Hawaii. I can't think of a climate more different than Norway, particularly in the winter. This is the US's first 100% renewable energy campus. With all the renewable energy coming on site at a campus level. The state of Hawaii has ambitious goals to be 100% renewable in 2045. The university system said, hey, we can beat that. We're going to be 100% renewable by 2035. And what they did is they used an ESCO model, an energy savings performance contracting, to first reduce energy use in all the buildings. First here on Maui College, but actually they've done this to 5 buildings. They have upgraded the HVAC, they've upgraded to LED lighting. They installed PV everywhere, over parking garages, over outside, on the tops of all the buildings. They've also added battery storage. There's no feed-in tariff in Hawaii. So if you don't use it, you lose it. So this is a unique facility in that it has 2.8 megawatts of solar PV and 13.2 megawatt hours of battery storage. What they generate in excess during the day, they are able to use at night. It's also configured as a giant microgrid. So it provides services back to the utility, such as frequency regulation, spinning reserves. It gets lots of compensation for the services that it provides back to improve the resiliency of the Hawaiian grid there. The neat thing about it is over 15, 20 years, this campus will save $79 million in costs. Now, the interesting thing is through the use of the ESCO model and energy savings performance contracting, all of this was done based on operational savings. So taxpayers didn't pay one extra penny for this. Ratepayers of the utility didn't pay one extra cent in order to get a net carbon campus like this. And it more than pays for itself over time. So I think I've shown 2 examples of buildings, one existing, a retrofit, one brand new, one in a hot, humid climate, one in Norway. These are kind of the bookends. And there are best practices in these facilities that can be applied all around the world. Hopefully this gives everyone a bit of a background and a grounding on what the opportunities are for decarbonizing buildings. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Clay, for that excellent scene setter. And those 2 examples are very interesting. I had a question, which is, what role do you see policy actually playing in supporting, for example, those 2 cases and other efforts at moving to zero carbon in the building sector?
Yeah, I think policy is absolutely critical. And we've done a survey called the Energy Efficiency Indicator. It's a global survey of organizations that are responsible for energy and sustainability in commercial, institutional, and industrial facilities. This is our 13th year, and we surveyed 1,500 people last year. And we actually asked that question. We've been tracking it for a decade. What are the policies that drive the greatest increase in investment in energy efficiency and clean energy technologies? Number 1 is actually benchmarking and certification. That didn't always be the case, but over the last 5 or 6 years, benchmarking and disclosing the performance of buildings. I mean, you buy a dishwasher, you know how much energy you use. You buy a car, you know how much fuel economy you're going to get. You buy the most expensive investment in your life or a company's life, and you have no idea how much energy it uses. Somehow that doesn't seem appropriate. So increasing policies to benchmark and through transparency disclose performance have the biggest driver on investment. Building codes and equipment standards are a standard. They're the stick. They put in place a minimum requirement for efficiency of buildings and equipment. Ranked third was owner-tenant agreements. There's this classic problem in commercial buildings and residences where the building owner makes the improvements, but the tenants get the benefit, or the tenants make the improvements and all the money goes to the building owner. There are things called green leases, which can align those incentives so that everyone wins when there are improvements over time. Carrots help. Incentives is the fourth biggest driver. Incentives can come from state and national agencies. They can come from utilities oftentimes. Setting targets was viewed next, and then finally leadership by example. Perhaps the best thing the governments around the world can do is lead by example and only lease space in green buildings, retrofit their own buildings, make their building stock a demonstration of the art of the possible and best practice within their communities. So I think a great example is New York City has turned a benchmarking policy into a building performance standard where they've added the stick, right? Where if you don't improve the performance of your building, by the way, it's the carbon performance of your building, not the energy performance. In Washington, D.C., it's energy. In New York, it's carbon. If you don't meet the minimum, then you're going to pay a fine. So I think policy is incredibly important. Thanks.
Great, thanks a lot for that. So policies matter, but it's also more than just about policy. And coming back to this issue about zero carbon buildings, I'd like to turn to Debbie, who works on the Zero Carbon Buildings for All initiative at WRI, which works with global stakeholders to examine how to get a decarbonized building sector, not only in developed economies, but also very importantly in developing economies. So Debbie, I think about one of the statistics that Clay had up, which was basically that 2/3 of current building space that will be here in 2050 already exists. And I understand that's basically really focused on advanced economies, while developing countries have a lot more yet to build. So maybe you could describe how this difference between what the existing stock looks like in developing countries, which is much smaller when we think about the future as compared to developed countries, how that affects our strategy when we think about decarbonizing.
Absolutely. Thanks, Philip. And thanks all for joining. I think it's a really interesting question, especially because very often zero carbon buildings are thought of as the domain of developed economies. That's where we have seen the most, high-tech demonstrations in North America and in Europe. And that is certainly an option, and it's one that's been really effective in demonstration. But it's not the only way. So Clay was just talking about leadership by example, and there are a lot of really interesting examples emerging from around the world on how you can actually go about decarbonizing the building sector or creating zero carbon buildings in ways that are that fit with the specific cultural and location geographical conditions that you find all over the world. So on the technical side, you might see either instead of or in addition to some of the high-tech approaches, passive design is really important. So the idea of how do you position a building? Do you have sunlight streaming in the afternoon in a hot climate? That's going to make it really hot inside. But if you can turn it so that you have more shading in the building, you're actually going to have a much more comfortable environment, and you're not going to need as much energy in order to provide a comfortable space for people to be. So shading, building position, daylighting, where the sort of opposite of that, where you do have windows that can let in the light, but that don't warm the inside, really, really critical. Together with that is the concept of really meeting energy service rather than just providing, the high sort of technological solutions. So for example, cooling is one that has been coming up a ton lately. Cooling the increasing demand for cooling is just massive. And there are enormous efforts underway, of course, to address that as well. But people don't need to have air conditioners necessarily. In some places you do, but what they really need is cooling as a service. And so there are a lot of different models for how you can achieve that. Everything from making sure you have the right size air conditioner if you're going to buy one, to using fans, to using natural ventilation and things like that, that can actually provide the same service as the technology. And the reason why these are particularly important, to your question, Philip, in developing economies where most of the buildings have yet to be built, is that you're constructing whole new buildings. So when you're working in the US and in Europe, a lot of the time you're renovating existing building stock. And in that case, there are fewer options for some of these. You're probably not going to pick up and turn your building to change the angle that the windows are facing. But if you're building, if you're constructing from the ground up, you have the opportunity to decide what is the optimal way to construct this building. Similarly, at that construction phase, you can think about what are the materials that we're using. Embodied carbon and embodied energy are becoming very quickly a conversation in the building sector on not just how much energy do our buildings use while we're in them, but how much energy and carbon do they use when we build them. So what kinds of materials are we using to build the buildings? Are we using sort of mud-based bricks that come from the local economy? Are we building tall glass buildings? In most places, you're going to have a mix of the two, but how can you innovate on materials to ensure that you are decreasing the overall energy consumption that sits in that building? And again, once you're renovating, you do still have to think about that in terms of the materials you're using to renovate your building, but you have even more opportunity when you're starting from scratch, essentially, and building from the ground up to think about what that looks like. And to sort of take it back even further one step, I think not just building each building, but in many places in the developing economies, you have a massive urbanization trend underway. And so you're not just building individual buildings, but you're really going to be building cities. And so you can think about buildings as part of an urban energy system. And so we talk about, it's a little bit of semantics, but the words we use matter. So when we talk about zero carbon buildings in terms of how do you make, a building or a set of buildings zero carbon, versus when we talk about building decarbonization, how do you think about this as a sector? And this was, Clay was talking about different examples of where you can draw the boundaries of decarbonizing a building or a system. When you're constructing a whole new city, you can think about how more energy intensive buildings can be complemented by carbon positive buildings in a way that, maybe you can put more solar in one part of a district or a city, and that can help to alleviate the energy needs of a hospital where there are certain corners that you're not going to cut. One example of this that I thought was really interesting that I've heard about in some of our international work was in the Philippines, where a really tall glass building was constructed, and it was a certified green building inside the building, but it actually was built with reflective glass, and it's very sunny in the Philippines, and it raised the temperature noticeably by several degrees for the buildings around it. So while you had that one building that was a green building certified, it wasn't necessarily helping to decarbonize the sector because that reflected energy had to be absorbed by the other buildings that then had to increase their cooling and use more energy. So thinking about that is really important. And then one other piece is just district energy systems. And Clay talked about this as well, and we can come back to it if we'd like. That when you're building and, when you're thinking about the urban energy system, you can think also about how do we want to provide the energy. And so thinking about buildings and how they consume energy together with district energy systems and how you actually provide that energy in a cleaner, more centralized way, that can be a really powerful solution together.
Right, thanks for that. I mean, a lot of very important points. I mean, if I could just come back to the cooling issue, which I think actually even is related to your urban design point that you made at the very end. Clearly, what we're seeing as temperatures are increasing, importance of cooling is also increasing, but more importantly, in developing countries, what we're seeing is increasing affluence is leading to an increasing demand for cooling. So even going back, I think, to the initial point that you made about passive design systems, because I must admit, based on my own experience in working in developing countries, a lot of time when you have poverty and you don't have access to modern materials and the like, you go very much with passive design systems, which really leads me into my a follow-on question I wanted to ask, a relatively brief response. But in some ways, what do you see as some of the opportunities and challenges for mutual learning between developed countries and developing countries?
Also a great question, and that passive design is one of the ones that I think is so critical. Again, there's this perception that decarbonized buildings or zero carbon buildings are the domain of the EU, North America, OECD, Asia, wealthier economies. I remember an anecdote from a couple of years ago. The World Green Building Council has led some really great work on decarbonizing buildings. They were sort of leading in this space around the world. And they held a 2-day workshop on zero carbon buildings in Jordan. And when they started out the workshop, there was a lot of perception that this didn't apply in the Middle East. Sort of, why are we having this conversation? And a day into the workshop, the group realized that most mosques in Jordan are actually built as zero carbon buildings because they use passive design principles, they use ventilation, and they do so in a way that they're actually already zero carbon. And so realizing that there are local materials, local construction methods and things like that that are everywhere, that we really can have not just lessons going from North America and Europe where you're doing high-tech demonstrations to developing economies, but also the other way around, where we can learn in North America and Europe how you can use these other principles to really improve what we're doing. I would say one of the real obstacles to, obviously there's a ton happening through those pilots and things that can be scaled in North America and Europe and in developed economies into developing economies. One of the real challenges is lack of data. So Clay was talking about the importance of benchmarking, transparency, certification. And one of the reasons why that's so important is because in a lot of places around the world, you don't have the data to understand what your baseline is. And if you don't know where you're starting from, it's really hard to map out what you need to do to get to zero carbon. So there are some tools that we can talk about that are trying to alleviate that and some interesting case studies. But I'll leave it at that for now.
Great, thanks for that. Thanks for that trip around the world in 8 minutes. But let's maybe come back to the US and in some ways get down to the nitty gritty. Amy, I know your organization works with stakeholders on developing low and zero carbon buildings in the US. And so maybe you could share some of your experiences and insights. So for example, what do you see are some of the keys to building or retrofitting zero carbon buildings in the US specifically?
Okay, great. Well, first off, thank you so much for having me. As you mentioned, I work at a place called New Buildings Institute. We're a national nonprofit, and despite our name, we conduct building science research on both new and existing high-performance buildings. So for about a decade, we've maintained a Getting to Zero database, which is a list of the highest performing buildings in North America. And currently we have over 700 buildings on the list, which have demonstrated that today's technologies can be used in very efficient buildings that produce their own energy and that it can be done for a reasonable cost. So this is it serves as a rich data set for us to kind of investigate patterns and commonalities of what these buildings do that is a little different than conventional practice. Sometimes the differences have to do with the technologies themselves, and other times it has to do with the process that is used to design, construct, and operate the building. So basically, we've learned a couple important things. One is that these buildings start with energy and carbon emission reduction in mind very early in the process. So it's often considered even before design begins, and sometimes it's paired with other sustainability goals like LEED certification. We find that if the owner and the design team are talking about these goals early in the process, like even in the interview, they're more likely to find a team that's committed to the result. And that's another commonality. All of these projects have a champion, someone who's making sure that the goals are achieved. The goals are another different thing about zero carbon buildings. They typically set an energy use intensity target, and so that they are definitely an efficient building to help manage some of those grid demand challenges that Clay talked about. And we also see in zero carbon buildings, they have a goal to eliminate on-site fossil fuel combustion. So the energy use target varies by what kind of building it is or where it's located. And we've done a lot of research to help teams select an appropriate target. Another thing we see about these buildings, they use all these passive design and integrated design concepts that Debbie had talked about, in new construction. They try to manage costs in a way that they spend more money on what we call the building envelope, the exterior of the building, the walls, the insulation, and the windows. And that is one way to make the building more resilient and better able to maintain comfortable temperatures even when the power is off. And then, the team offsets these increased costs on the architecture with smaller system costs, like on the mechanical system. So ultimately, it's the same budget, but they invest in the part of the building that's going to be around the longest, right? It has in retrofits, it's a little different. We notice that successful projects leverage specific opportunities over the building's life cycle. This is, specifically when there's a major renovation. But like Clay said, those don't happen very often. So also when gas using systems are replaced, they'll think about how do they replace that with electric. And, when they're doing investment grade audits, they have to look at things a little bit differently. They need to make sure that they're looking at electrical capacity, right? Which may need to be bigger if they're replacing gas equipment with electric equipment. Or perhaps they pay more attention to the roof and the structure of the roof to make sure it can support photovoltaic panels if that's in the plan for the building. A couple of things from a technical perspective, we've had some interesting findings. I think we tend to think of HVAC systems all together, right? Heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. But one of the major findings in the 700 buildings that we've studied are that in zero energy and zero carbon buildings, we notice a separation of the space conditioning, the heating, and the cooling, and that's separate from the ventilation. And that's one thing that's a little different. They don't always use the same type of heating or cooling system, but the separation is one thing that was notable. And then one thing that I think is really basic, but it's actually important to say, is that these buildings actually measure their energy performance, like going back to that benchmarking aspect. I mean, sometimes the act of actually going back to see how the building is performing and then adjusting it when it varies from what you're expecting is something that's noticeably different, and it makes sense if you think about it. Architects and design teams, once they construct a building, they're kind of off to the next project, and there's never really been this feedback loop. And so what we're seeing in this these early adopters and these innovators is that they're actually truing up their models, they're learning lessons, and then the next building is actually better. So we are seeing that importance of this feedback loop. And then finally, another rapidly evolving trend, I think, in the industry is embodied carbon. We've talked a little bit about the carbon emissions that are associated with the materials and the construction process itself. We're seeing a lot more teams focus on reducing embodied carbon in materials. So those are a couple of our key findings about what makes a zero carbon building successful.
Great. Thanks, Amy, for that. I have a sort of a follow-on question, which is, I asked Clay about policy. I'd like to ask you about money. And so maybe if you could describe some of the innovative funding mechanisms that you're seeing that building owners can use to access capital to retrofit their existing buildings.
Yeah, thinking about how you're going to pay for the transition to the low carbon built environment, you do have to think about financing, but also managing costs, right? Like some of those things I had just mentioned about starting early, having a goal, having committed design team, and measuring the result. Those are about managing costs. I also talked a little bit about retrofits and leveraging specific events in the building's life cycle. And another reason that these are the trigger events is because that's often when traditional loan or debt financing is arranged anyway, right? So what we're trying to do is leverage the funds that already exist and make sure the buildings are building back, or building in a way that's not just a like for like replacement, but it's a like for better, and they're actually implementing deep retrofits. So, as far as financing goes, owners in some states can leverage something called commercial property assessed clean energy, and it's called CPACE for short. This allows building owners to borrow money for efficiency, renewable energy, or decarbonization projects, and then they can make repayments on their property tax bill. So that remains with the property even if it's sold, which encourages long-term investment in building performance. Say if someone's going to sell the property, that investment continues with the property. CPACE can be funded sometimes by private investors, sometimes there are government programs, but it's only available in the states with enabling legislation and active programs where you can do that. On the residential side, Fannie Mae Green Rewards Program has issued, I think, 75 billion they reported in green mortgage-backed securities. And they put requirements on the projects for at least 30% savings on energy and water. Typically, they do put minimum energy savings requirements, but I think it's only about 15%. So I'm not sure how exactly that aligns with zero carbon buildings just yet, though. But those are available for green buildings. Utilities have on-bill financing programs sometimes, which can help provide capital. And in addition, a lot of utilities have, or state governments or federal governments sometimes have provide financial incentives for high performance equipment, which can offset costs and help improve the return on investment. On the solar side, we've seen a lot of what's called power purchase agreements. It's a financing agreement where a developer arranges for the design, permitting, financing, and installation of a solar energy system. And it's typically off the balance sheet of the building owner, which can be quite helpful. The developer then sells the power back to the building owner at a fixed rate that's lower than the utility retail rate. So the developer receives income from the sales of electricity and also some tax credits. And the PPAs range about 10-year arrangement, but at the end the customer can either extend it, have the developer remove the system, or buy the solar from the developer. So. And then Clay mentioned for large owners, energy savings performance contracts with third party come in and install and maintain equipment with a savings guarantee. But those are typically most suited for larger, more complex projects, maybe with higher upfront costs. So those are a couple of the financing approaches that we have.
Great, Amy. Thanks a lot for that. There's obviously a lot going on. And actually, we've already received a number of very interesting questions. So why don't I turn to those? And the one issue that's come up in a couple of questions really picks on something that all of you have touched upon, which is you've mentioned really different levels of government, municipalities, states, central government. And I guess the question is, how do you see the role of different levels of government? And to what extent does the fact that you have multiple levels of government often involved in this area present opportunities and challenges? So why don't we go with you, Clay, first, and then Debbie, and then you, Amy, and then we'll flip the order on some of the follow-up questions.
I've already talked a lot. I'm going to pass it to Debbie because Debbie's project epitomizes the relationship between national governments and state and local governments. So I'm going to relinquish the spot to Debbie.
Thanks, Clay.
You have more time now, Debbie, to answer.
I won't take advantage. It's a really critical question. So generally we see that national policy is, well, let me back up. Clay was talking about a project that we've been running for about 5 years, the Building Efficiency Accelerator, which currently works with 55 cities and states in 25 countries around the world on improving their buildings. And there are a lot of different things that we could say from what we've learned around the world from this project over the last 5 years. We started work at the city and state level very intentionally because cities and states and local governments are the ones who are implementing when it comes to buildings, right? Buildings are a local industry. Construction and renovation happens locally. And the policies as well, when you talk about building codes, a lot of incentives, they all are implemented at the state and local level. There's, of course, different models of this for how it's done in different places, but ultimately where the rubber hits the road is state and local government when it comes to implementation and enforcement. What we found over the course of a couple of years was even for the leading cities, there were barriers that they would hit without the enabling environment of supportive national policy. So there's a lot that cities can do on implementation and a lot that states can do on implementation. But at some point, if you don't have, Clay was mentioning, there's no feed-in tariff, for instance, in Hawaii, I think it was. That if you don't have that, it becomes really challenging to decarbonize your electricity supply, to convince people that they should put solar on the roof because it might not make sense financially. Similarly, for buildings, there are some financing mechanisms that flow through the national government. Codes tend to be designed at the national level, even though they're implemented at the local level. So how that national code is designed has huge implications for how much of a decarbonization, how far along the decarbonization pathway you can go. So there are incentive policies at the national level. And then critically, Clay mentioned benchmarking and transparency. You don't have, at the local and state level, you don't have sufficient technical expertise or capacity for every city and state to reinvent. How do we benchmark? What tools should we create? How can we compare one building to another, et cetera? And so having that technical resource capacity at the national level and then being able to share that across cities and states is so important for really being able to meet the ambitious goals that we need to meet.
Great, thanks a lot. So Amy, you who have had to build these things, what's your sense in terms of different levels of government? And maybe you could describe what are the levels of government you have tended to interact with more?
Yeah, so at New Buildings Institute, we're involved with basically all the various levels of government. So Debbie mentioned that energy codes are written at we have national model-based codes that are written, and NBI has been involved in the development of those codes. But those codes have to get adopted at the state level, and that process is different in all 50 states. And some states, you can't do any better. Any cities can't do any better than what the state requires. In other states, cities can do, Colorado, a city can have whatever energy code they want. I'm here in Oregon where, we're bound, cities are bound by the state code. There are some states that have been very aggressive on energy codes. California, Washington State, Massachusetts is doing a lot of work. So it really varies. And I think if you think about energy codes, it's really only new construction, existing buildings. And as we get into building performance standards, we are seeing cities take the lead on those. And there's a lot to be discussed, right? Are they about energy? Are they about carbon? We're seeing kind of a sprinkling of ideas I think there are 5 building performance standards now. and they're all under development, and they're all slightly different. And it's a way that we're going to learn from the experiences of a variety of these different cities. But it really is going to take action at all three levels: federal, state, and local, to help achieve our ambitious goals.
Great. Thanks a lot for all those answers. And if I could just maybe ask a follow-on, because in some ways when we've been talking about government in this context, we've been talking a lot about codes, and there's been a lot of emphasis on the policy side. But obviously governments also own a lot of buildings and the like. They're actually implementers. And I think back to, Clay's description of the survey that said one of the key things is government leading by example. So maybe you could, each of you could touch upon this issue of the government's role beyond the issue of catalyzing private sector investment. Why don't we start with you, Debbie, at this point, and then we'll go to Amy, and then we'll go to Clay. Debbie.
I feel like I'm going first again. It's a great question. So cities, especially, and national governments have a ton of infrastructure, and in particular, procurement and the incentives that cities can provide through procurement policy is really important. One of the emerging areas that we've talked about a couple of times, for example, is on embodied carbon in building materials. And there's a lot of discussion now about what kinds of policies can cities and states, for instance, put in place in order to move the needle and incentivize lower carbon materials, because it's something that's really new. So often you see that leadership by example. If you think about sort of a market transformation curve, in order to sort of start moving the market, cities have the ability to use these levers of bulk purchasing, where they might be able to bring the costs down. They might be able to incentivize producers of these materials, or it's the same with zero carbon or low carbon buildings in general. They can use the large portfolio of buildings that they have to incentivize producers, construction companies, et cetera, to try new things, and to do so in a space that's a little bit safer, in a way that they can experiment. And as you learn by doing, the costs come down, and that helps pave the way for the rest of the market. So it's a really critical tool, especially for sort of more leading edge, I would say, approaches to zero carbon buildings and low carbon buildings.
Great, thanks for that. Amy?
Yeah, definitely governments can lead by example, and they are. There's evidence all over the country. I think we had it early, with LEED buildings. We saw lots of governments require LEED buildings of their own. And we're seeing that now with zero energy and zero carbon buildings, for sure. I mean, whether it's like executive orders in California, for example, which, set state goals, but then they set the goals for their own portfolios even more aggressively, like they're going to achieve it 10 years before the rest of the state is going to achieve decarbonization. But there are examples all over, and we're starting to see more cities and states be more specific about the energy and carbon aspects, right? So they're kind of pairing, oh yes, they want to do a LEED building, but that's going to be zero energy and zero carbon as well. And so we're working with a number of cities and states that are interested in integrating this into their own portfolio through, strategic energy management and fossil fuel reduction in their own buildings.
Great, thanks, Clay. And Clay, in answering, I'm also be interested if either of those two examples you had also involved governments.
Yeah. So one role that I think federal government can play, and has done a really good job is I'm a big fan of the Better Buildings program and the Better Plants Challenge. And I think that's a global best practice that has been emulated in countries, particularly developing countries all around the world. And if you look at going as a notion of leaders in commercial buildings, cities, real estate portfolios, manufacturers, basically challenging each other to ambitious goals, setting targets, measuring performance, publicly reporting that performance. And it has grown over the years to encompass, I forget the exact numbers, but something like 14% of the manufacturing footprint in the United States, and double-digit percentage of commercial buildings in the cities that participate. No, in the entire country. It's just a great way of sharing best practices. Some of the elements of the program that are so attractive are everyone who participates has a showcase project showing a best practice. Everyone publishes a process model, at least in Better Plants Challenge, where you share a key process or a key practice that you've implemented in order to meet the goals. So I think that there's a great opportunity for voluntary programs as well. And I can't help but remember when executive orders would challenge, for instance, the federal government facilities to invest $2 billion in energy savings performance contracts. Guess what? They invested $2 billion. And guess what? When there was another executive order and setting a target, they met that target. So there's something magical about setting ambitious targets, measuring, reporting, and delivering performance.
Great. So you're basically pointing out how even the government, when it sets targets for itself, actually delivers on them. We actually got, you mentioned energy service performance contracts, and we actually got a few questions on energy ESCOs. So why don't we turn to that? Maybe we'll go Amy, Clay, and Debbie this time. Amy, maybe if you could give a sense for us as to what you see are some of the advantages or of ESCOs and maybe some of the challenges that they're facing and that the whole effort in decarbonization faces in terms of the role of ESCOs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, ESCOs are a way to help bring financing to the table and to provide or to have experts that are able to help operate the building and make sure the buildings are operated very efficiently. Typically, like I mentioned, they're suited for larger projects. Like we see a lot of ESCOs in what we call the mush market, municipalities, universities, schools, and hospitals, right? One owner, lots of buildings, big systems. And they are able to provide a savings guarantee and take that off the balance sheet. But if they're, the challenge, I would say the con is for smaller projects, they're more of a challenge. We haven't seen as many, and one trend that we're starting to see is really deep energy reductions, as opposed to going in there, it's really, the lighting part is really easy, right? You change out a bunch of light bulbs, you could calculate on a spreadsheet what the savings are. When all the systems have to be integrated, it gets a little bit more complicated. So having these, I think as we get towards zero carbon buildings, starting to think about these contracts and how we can manage to a low energy target is one way that they may be able to evolve over time to help get to zero carbon.
Great, thanks. Clay?
Actually, I'll let Debbie go. I've got a lawnmower right outside my window. I apologize.
You keep deferring to Debbie, Clay, so now we're next you off the list. All right, next question, I'll start with you. Debbie?
No, it's okay. Lawnmower is gone. Murphy in webinars is always there. There's a dog barking. There's a weed whacker or something. I apologize. So I remember when ESPC started in the US, unfortunately. You can tell from my hair that I actually started at Johns Controls in 1982 as a summer intern. And in 1985, the state of Ohio put forth enabling legislation for what became performance contracting, because schools wanted to update their lighting, adding in fluorescent lighting, and they knew it would pay for itself over time but school districts were not allowed to enter into long-term contracts because of an annual budget cycle. So the enabling legislation allowed them to contract with a prime contractor who would both engineer, design, install, commission, and guarantee the performance. And that was the beginning of the US ESPC. And that model pretty much retains today. There were earlier things in the 80s, which were called shared savings models, where, the technology risk, whatever, the building owner would say, yeah, okay, if I see savings in my bill, I'll give you some of it. That's the dominant model in China. They use predominantly a shared savings model. And unlike the mush market, which Amy referred to in the federal government, it's primarily industrial. And they tend to focus on very simple single measure things like heat recovery, or on insulation or compressed air or something. There are specialty ESCOs which deal with a single technology, and they basically use a shared savings model. The implication of that is there are 4,000 ESCOs in China, and they can't get very large because the assets are actually on their balance sheet. So what we see around the world, and the World Bank is really a leader in this, of being able to adapt these models, hybrid models that work in different parts of the world. One model that I particularly like is really based on the construction process, where the contractor gets 80% of the capital up front, but 20%, essentially their profit, is held for a period of a year or two until independent third-party measurement and verification verifies that the savings are there. No savings, you don't get the 20%. The 20% goes into an escrow fund, and the independent M&V provides the funding. That appears to be a very successful model in, say, Latin America and in other emerging economies. So finance is critically important, but it varies region to region, in fact, country to country.
Great, thanks. I think that's a great segue into Debbie, your comments.
Thanks, Philip. So just to add, I think Clay and Amy covered most of it. I would just add a couple of interesting examples we've seen around the world. So there was one for street lighting, which is a little bit different, but follows the same general model as building retrofits, that I remember an interesting example of aggregation. So Amy mentioned that ESCOs work best when you have large projects. If you are, for instance, a small town in Canada, and you want to retrofit your streetlights, that is not a large project. It's a very small project. And so there was a really interesting example of in one province in Canada, I think it was Ontario, where they actually aggregated a whole bunch of small towns together so that they could together have sort of the purchasing power and the collective, project approach of a large project. And each municipality had some bandwidth on negotiating the specific specifications that they needed, but to bring them together in a way that made that sort of palatable for the ESCO model so that they could renovate their streetlights. And you could envision a similar portfolio, or you do see a similar portfolio approach for buildings. One other thing that I would mention, and Clay, I don't know if you're going to want to say something else about this, but I would mention is in a couple of places you see super ESCOs. So Etihad in Dubai and Energy Efficiency Services Limited, EESL in India, that really aim to jumpstart the creation of the ESCO market by facilitating access to finance, building the capacity of local ESCOs, and sort of doing those retrofits. In the case of EESL, they actually also do bulk procurement, so kind of a hybrid model between the two. And that's a really interesting way to try to build up the ESCO market. Clay could probably say a lot more about that. I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to add.
I'll say a little more about it. They're essentially public-private partnerships, right? These super ESCOs are a quasi-government entity that basically organizes a market of energy efficiency installers and service providers and leverages scale through procurement. EESL is the most famous. We want to buy 1 billion LED light bulbs, and And we're going to, work with utilities and service providers to install them. Next was super high efficient mini splits. Efficient, air conditioning using low GWP refrigerants. Let's get them in the hands of people. And this idea has been very active in a number of Middle Eastern countries. And actually, the Berlin Energy Agency is a pretty good example of a government agency setting rules and standards and driving the industry there. There's so many opportunities for the private sector to partner with governments at different levels to be able to deliver the scale of efficiency and clean energy improvements we need.
Right, very interesting. And I think this point about bulk procurement is often overlooked. We've seen massive savings. EESL has had a wonderful experience. World Bank has had a similar excellent experience in Mexico with lighting and the light. So the ability to aggregate really can drive down costs. We've spent a little more than an hour, and an important topic that we have not yet touched upon is the impact of COVID-19. So that's something I'd like to turn to. I mean, in some ways, as somebody once recently told me, we've just gone through an experiment in which we've emptied out all our commercial space. And I think also when I think about, Amy, a comment you made about the issue of ventilation, and we're all thinking about how we're going to have to reconfigure commercial space. So what I would like is maybe for each of you to touch upon what you see as some of the maybe opportunities, challenges, and dynamics around the interface of COVID-19 and what we're trying to do here in terms of the building space. I'll start with you, Clay.
Yeah, I've been spending a lot of time. Our company was involved in responding to the coronavirus pandemic in Wuhan. We were one of the first companies on the ground building a temporary hospital in Wuhan, an emergency healthcare facility. We took that expertise to the US and have been involved in many of the early temporary facilities. And of course, being in the heating, ventilating, air conditioning, and controls business, a lot of the technology that can really help limit infection spread, things like filtration, things like ventilation, things like air treatment, things like tracking and tracing, individuals to enforce social distancing. Those are all technologies that have been around for a long time, but they've been used in hospitals, in surgical suites and isolation rooms. And now we're getting calls from K-12 school districts because every school has a nursing office and there are potentially, COVID positive kids and staff and faculty in these things. So it has really thrown the energy efficiency industry on its head. It's also put over 400,000 energy efficiency workers out of work in the United States because you can't go in and audit homes, you can't retrofit homes, you can't audit commercial buildings. So it's had a huge economic impact. But people are now starting to see the connection. Also, I think I might have been the one to mention the grand experiment. All of our commercial buildings in major cities are basically empty. And it's interesting, even in New York, which I showed a great picture of, talking about all the new office space, energy is only down like 10, 15%. And the Mexico's down is like 20% compared to the same time a year ago at 9 o'clock in the morning and late in the afternoon just due to commuting. And the Empire State Building was all lit up with its LED energy efficient, lights. They did a bit of an experiment because it's basically empty. There's no one in the observation deck, and they completely shut down energy systems, air handling units and things, nobody in there. They did it as an experiment. The lowest they could get was a 28% reduction, 28%. There's all kinds of stuff going on in these buildings. There are servers spinning away, serving up Zoom webinars like this. There are refrigerators and everything still plugged in the kitchens. There are printers and computers and monitors and things such as that. So in one way, it's really taught us how challenging it's going to be to really get, an additional 40, 50% of energy out of our buildings that are becoming increasingly energized through various technologies. But I think the opportunity is, and there's a new bill in California, AB 841, that basically is trying to connect those two things. It is funding to utilities to provide energy efficiency retrofits that improve ventilation and filtration in schools so they can open safely. And I think there is an opportunity now, with more concern about the indoor environment and the fact that doing it poorly could actually increase energy use, that's how we would turn, lemons into lemonade and take advantage of stimulus funding and great concern about the indoor environment to make it more environmentally friendly as well.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. I mean, it's sort of maybe in some ways disconcerting. We empty out the buildings. Commercial energy use doesn't drop that much, but residential electricity bills are going way up. Amy?
Yeah, there is a chance. I mean, 2020 will go down in benchmarking data as the year you're going to have to asterisk this year, right? I mean, because the data is going to be different than all other years, and is certainly nothing is typical. But it really, COVID, I think the concern is a lot more energy use will be used for ventilation. So we have to think about this as an opportunity to dovetail adequate COVID response with better ventilation and low carbon emissions, right? So this is one of those opportunities, those trigger events that we need to leverage in the building's life cycle. So like Clay mentioned, AB 841 in California, $600 million for schools to help address ventilation. Like, that's the opportunity, right? Those systems are going to change. They're going to be in place for the next 15, 20, 30 years, right? Like, this is when we have the opportunity to dovetail adequate COVID response and low emissions at the same time.
Right, thanks. Debbie?
Sure. So I think that one of the things that this is really bringing to the fore is the impact that buildings have on people. People spend, especially in cities, people spend most of their time inside. In the US, it's upwards of 90% in a city that you spend inside, maybe more right now. And at the same time, COVID has revealed a lot, not just about buildings, but about race and equity and how different people experience the built environment and experience their communities. And so we talked a little bit early on about stakeholder engagement. And usually when we talk about stakeholder engagement, we're talking about technical stakeholders. We're talking about the construction industry and designers and developers and architects, and that is really, really important. And you need all those people at the table. We also need to think about who's involved in early conversations about how both policy decisions and sort of project and construction decisions, and making sure that there's equal representation across our communities and who's benefiting from the buildings that we improve. So if you select a downtown office building for renovation, you're going to impact a very different population than if you select a community center. And so this is, of course, a whole other conversation, but a really critical one in terms of how COVID can change how we and improve how we think about decarbonizing the building sector, and do it in a way that's inclusive and equitable and really provides benefits across our communities.
Great, thanks very much for raising that point, Amy, about stakeholder participation. I mean, clearly we have inequality issues, inclusion, empowerment. These are all important dynamics that often sometimes have gotten lost when we think of more technical issues about buildings. Thanks to everybody for all those wonderful questions and also the answers from the panelists. What I'd like to do is do a rapid round, give each of you 30 seconds to give your perspective on what's an important point or whatever it is you'd like to talk about in this regard. We'll do Amy, then Debbie, and then Clay. Amy, go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for having me. The time is certainly now. Coming. I'm in Portland, Oregon, and we haven't seen the sun in a week, and it is very apparent the importance of a sustainable built environment that is low energy and low carbon. So there are opportunities and ways to get all of these strategies to scale. We have studied for decades, that which we say that which exists is possible. These buildings are out there, and we know it can be done. And there are ways to transform the market to lower emissions equipment and make sure that efficiency is equitable for everyone. So.
Thanks, Amy. Debbie?
I'm going to stick a little bit to the people theme again, because I think it's really critical that when we talk about decarbonization in the building sector, we get technical really quickly, and that's incredibly important. The idea of how we can learn across cultures and across geographies is really important, and making sure that the lessons that we are learning as we innovate and pilot new ways of constructing and operating our buildings don't just stay within our own communities, but that we are really sharing across organizations, across cities, across states, and across countries, because this is something, one of the benefits and also one of the huge challenges of the building sector is you have to touch every single building, and there are a lot of them. And so if we leave it to every city, state, and country to work this out on their own, we're not going to achieve the progress we need in the time that we need it. So that collaboration and cooperation within cities, within states, within countries, and within our global community is so important to make sure that all of our people can get the benefits of decarbonization.
Thanks for that. And when you touch every building, you'll touch every person as well. Clay?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks so much for moderating our panel and to the organizers. So I think it's very important that we view decarbonization as a systems problem. I talked about the 4 good deeds of decarbonization, electrification, efficiency, and digitalization, but efficiency is really the most important. IEA's analysis of clean energy impacts on the Paris Agreement suggests that energy efficiency needs to deliver over half of the emission reductions, and that it can do it with existing technologies, and it can do it with a positive return on investment. It's not a cost, it's an investment. And I think as we think about decarbonization, I prefer saying decarbonization in the built environment, because I think the image most people have is like that building in Norway. Here's a really odd looking building covered in solar PV panels. I can't see that next to my village in, Southern Africa. And I think it's important for us to draw the boundary at the community level. Not every building can have enough solar PV on it to turn it into a net zero carbon building, but every building in the world can improve their efficiency and will provide cost reduction for the owners, can improve health, improve comfort, improve safety, and we can do it in an equitable way because of the fact that it does pay for itself over time. So efficiency first, but we got to solve the big problem as well. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks. And thanks to the entire panel, and thanks to everyone for attending and for your great questions. If you're interested in the Energy Security and Climate Change Program, visit us at csis.org/energy. Please stay tuned for the final event of the Climate Solution Series, which will be a cross-sectoral event on direct air capture and natural climate solutions, which we'll be holding in November. So if we were all together, I would normally say, let's clap, but I'll mute myself, but I'll clap for our panels. Thank you to everyone. Bye-bye.